In the summer of 1944, trains arrived at a place most people had never heard of, and those who did feared to even whisper its name, Auschwitz. The doors slid open with a metallic scream. Inside, there was confusion. Mothers clutching children, men trying to look brave, suitcases packed as if this were just a relocation, not the end of a life. And then, there was a man. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. He didn't look like a soldier at all. Dressed in a clean uniform, polished boots, and white gloves, he stood calmly on the platform, observing, almost curious. With the smallest movement of his hand, he began to separate people into two lines, left, right. No explanations, no hesitation. Some walked away together. Others were torn apart in seconds. A child from a mother, a husband from a wife, without ever understanding why. Witnesses would later remember something unsettling. He was polite. He spoke softly. Sometimes he even smiled. And yet those who passed before him knew, somehow, that this quiet man held something far more terrifying than rage. He held certainty. Because for him, this wasn't chaos. It wasn't cruelty. It was order, a system, a purpose. And what happened after that platform would haunt history forever. But here's the part few people truly understand. The man standing there, the one deciding who lived and who disappeared, did not see himself as a villain. He believed he was doing something important, necessary, even scientific. And when the war finally ended, when the world began hunting down men like him, he was gone. No trial, no execution, no justice, just a name that would slowly turn into a shadow. This is the story of a man who stood at the edge of life and death, and then simply walked away. Josef Mengele was not born into chaos. He was born into comfort. On March 16, 1911, in the quiet Bavarian town of Günzburg, his life began in a house where nothing seemed out of place. His father, Karl Mengele, was a respected industrialist, the owner of a successful company that manufactured agricultural machinery. The name Mengele meant stability. It meant reliability. It meant that the future was already taken care of. There were expectations, and Joseph intended to meet them. From an early age, he showed signs of discipline and ambition. He was not rebellious. He was not isolated. He did what was expected of him, and did it well. Teachers described him as serious, focused, and intelligent. The kind of young man who didn't stand out by causing trouble, but by quietly excelling. He wasn't searching for identity. He already had one. In the early 1930s, as Germany struggled through economic collapse and political instability, Joseph entered university. He chose to study philosophy, then medicine, and eventually anthropology, a combination that, at the time, seemed both prestigious and forward-thinking. But the world he stepped into was changing. Germany was no longer just rebuilding itself. It was redefining itself. Ideas about race, biology, and human value were beginning to dominate academic spaces. Scientists, doctors, and intellectuals were increasingly drawn into a new kind of thinking, one that promised order through classification, control through science. Human beings, they believed, could be measured, improved, perfected. And for a young man like Josef Mengele, this was not alarming. It was fascinating. In 1935, he earned his doctorate in physical anthropology. His research focused on racial differences, how to identify them, how to categorize them, how to prove them scientifically. A year later, he passed his medical exams, continuing his path toward becoming both a doctor and a researcher. Two roles, one purpose: to understand the human body, and, more importantly, how it could be shaped. One of the most significant influences on his thinking came from a man named Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer, a well-known geneticist who specialized in twin research. Under Verschuer's guidance, Mengele began to develop a deep interest in heredity. Twins, in particular, became an obsession, because twins offered something unique, a way to study nature itself. If two people shared the same genetic structure, then any differences between them could reveal something deeper, something hidden. To many, this was a legitimate scientific question. To Mengele, it was something more, a key, a doorway into understanding how traits could be controlled, manipulated, and perhaps even engineered. At this point, nothing about him seemed extraordinary in a dangerous way. He was educated. He was respected. He was moving exactly where the system wanted him to go. And then, the system changed. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power. And with him, the ideas that had once been debated in academic halls were no longer just theories. They became policy. The concept of racial purity, once a subject of research, was now a national priority. Universities adapted, institutions aligned. Science was no longer just about discovery. It was about validation, proving that the ideology was correct. And Josef Mengele did not resist this shift. He embraced it. By 1937, he had joined the Nazi Party. Shortly after, he became a member of the SS, the elite organization tasked not only with enforcing the regime's will, but with shaping its future. This was not a reluctant decision. It was a step forward. Because for someone like Mengele, the Nazi system offered something no university ever could: unlimited application of theory, no ethical boundaries, no restrictions, only results. When World War II began, Mengele was assigned as a medical officer in the Waffen-SS. He was sent to the Eastern Front, where the war was brutal, chaotic, and unforgiving. But even there, he stood out, not for cruelty, not for recklessness, but for competence. He treated wounded soldiers. He performed his duties efficiently. Reports described him as reliable, even commendable. At one point, he was awarded for bravery after rescuing soldiers from a burning tank. He was not failing within the system. He was succeeding. And then, everything shifted. During the fighting, Mengele was wounded. The injury was serious enough that he was declared unfit for further frontline service. For most soldiers, this would have meant a step back, a safer role, a quieter assignment. But in Nazi Germany, usefulness was never wasted. If he could not serve on the battlefield, he would be reassigned somewhere else, somewhere his skills could be better utilized. By 1943, that place was chosen. Not a hospital, not a university, but a location that combined both science and absolute control. A place where thousands of people arrived every day. A place where decisions were made instantly. A place where no one could refuse. Auschwitz. And here is what makes this moment so important. Josef Mengele was not sent there as punishment. He did not resist. He did not hesitate. He accepted. Because to him, this was not a descent into darkness. It was an opportunity, an environment where everything he had studied, every theory, every idea, every belief, could finally be put into practice, without limits, without questions, without consequences. And when he arrived, he would not just become another doctor in a uniform. He would step into a role that would define him forever, not as a soldier, not as a scientist, but as something far more unsettling. A man who believed he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. The train did not arrive suddenly. It announced itself long before anyone could see it. A distant, metaliczki skrzydlet, the slow, grinding rhythm of wheels against tracks. Inside the wagon, people felt it before they understood it. The shift, the deceleration, the uneasy silence that follows when something is about to end, or begin. For days, they had been packed together in darkness. No space to sit, no air to breathe properly. The smell of fear, sweat, and something far worse hanging in the heat. Some tried to comfort children. Others stopped speaking entirely. Time dissolved inside that wagon. Hours, days. It no longer mattered. All that mattered was the stop. And then, the train came to a halt. For a moment, nothing happened. No explanation. No voices. Just silence pressing in from all sides. Then the doors were thrown open. Light exploded into the darkness. People raised their hands to shield their eyes. Shapes became figures. Figures became men in uniforms, shouting in a language that cut through the confusion like a blade. Dogs barked. Orders were screamed. The illusion of control disappeared instantly. Out! Schnell! Raus! They stumbled forward, falling from the wagon onto gravel and Железные рельсы, trying to gather what little they had left. Suitcases were dropped. Children were lifted, pulled, carried. People looked around desperately, trying to understand where they were. Some still believed this was relocation. That belief didn't last long, because beyond the chaos, beyond the shouting and the movement, there was something else. Something that didn't fit. A man. He stood slightly apart from the others. No rush. No anger. No visible urgency. His uniform was clean. Impossibly clean. His boots polished. His posture straight. Almost composed. As if he were observing rather than participating. In his hand, a pair of white gloves. He did not look like the others. He did not behave like them. And yet, something about him drew attention more than all the shouting combined. This was Josef Mengele. But the people stepping off the train did not know his name. They only knew that he was watching, carefully. As if each person mattered, but not in the way they hoped. He stepped forward, not abruptly, not aggressively, measured, controlled. His eyes moved quickly, taking in details most people would miss: age, posture, signs of illness, strength, weakness. He didn't need long, a second, maybe less. Then his hand moved, a simple gesture, left or right. That was all. No explanation followed, no warning, just a direction. Some were told to go left, others to the right. The lines formed almost automatically, people following instructions because that was the only thing left to do. Confusion spread, but not panic. Not yet. There was still a fragile hope that this was some kind of registration process. A sorting. A temporary separation. Families tried to stay together. Sometimes they succeeded. Often they didn't. A mother holding her child would be stopped with a quiet motion of the hand. The child sent one way, the mother another. No argument, no time. Just a correction, as if something had been placed in the wrong category. A husband turned back toward his wife. Too slow. A guard pushed him forward. The line kept moving. And through all of it, Mengele remained calm. He did not shout. He did not strike anyone. At times, he even spoke. Short questions. Soft tone. How old are you? Are you in good health? If someone answered confidently, stood straight, tried to appear strong, they might be sent one way. If they hesitated, the other. Witnesses would later recall this detail again and again, as if trying to understand it even years later. He was polite. That was what made it worse. Because cruelty is expected to look like rage. But this did not. This looked like routine, like efficiency, like someone doing exactly what they were trained to do. The lines moved quickly, too quickly. There was no time to question, no time to process. Decisions were made in seconds, but their consequences stretched far beyond anything the people in those lines could imagine. Some were directed toward trucks, others toward barracks. No one explained why. And the man in white gloves continued, patient and precise, his hand rising and falling in small, almost casual motions. Left, right, left, right. To him, it was not chaos. It was order. A system functioning exactly as intended. each person placed where they belonged, according to criteria only he fully understood. There was no hesitation in his movements, no visible doubt. He did not look at what he was doing as something heavy or irreversible. He looked at it as necessary, as correct. For the people standing in front of him, this moment was everything. The last chance to remain with someone they loved. The last moment of uncertainty before the unknown. But for him, it was just another train, another group, another series of decisions. And when one transport was finished, another would arrive. And he would stand there again, clean, calm, certain. Because what happened on that platform was only the beginning. The real horror did not happen in front of everyone. It happened after the lines disappeared. What happened after the platform was not loud. There were no shouting guards, no chaos, no desperate movement, just doors, closed ones. For those who had been sent to the left or right, the meaning of that choice was still unclear. Some were marched toward barracks. Others were separated again, filtered into smaller groups, watched more closely now. And among them, there were certain people who stood out, children, twins, those who looked unusual in any way, physically, genetically, visibly different. They were noticed, not by accident, by design. When Josef Mengele stepped away from the platform, his role did not end. It changed. Because beyond the noise of arrivals and selections, there existed another part of Auschwitz, quieter, more controlled, almost clinical. A place where chaos was replaced with routine, and where people were no longer sorted, but studied. The children were taken to separate barracks. At first, nothing about it felt immediately threatening. They were not beaten, not like the others. They were given slightly better clothing, sometimes more food. In a place where survival depended on scraps and chance, this difference was impossible to ignore. Some began to believe they had been lucky, chosen for work, or even protection. It was a dangerous misunderstanding, because what they were actually chosen for had nothing to do with survival. It had to do with value. To Mengele, these were not prisoners in the usual sense. They were material, opportunities, especially the twins. Identical faces, identical structures, two lives sharing the same genetic beginning. To him, this was not something to protect. It was something to unlock. He would visit them regularly, not as a distant authority, but directly. He spoke to them, asked questions, observed them closely, often in silence. Witnesses would later recall something unsettling about these encounters. He remembered details, names, faces, differences between siblings. He paid attention. And in an environment where most prisoners were treated as if they were invisible, this attention could feel almost comforting. Some children trusted him, or at least they didn't fear him in the way they feared others. He did not behave like a guard. He behaved like a doctor, calm, precise, interested. There were routines. The children were lined up, measured, compared, height, weight, eye color, bone structure. Everything recorded, everything noted. The process was methodical, almost repetitive. And that was part of what made it so difficult to understand. Because nothing about it looked like chaos. Nothing about it looked like madness. It looked like work, like research, like something that belonged in a university, not a camp surrounded by barbed wire and smoke. But Auschwitz had no boundaries left. Science and power existed in the same space. And there was no one there to question what was happening. For Mengele, this was the ideal environment. No limitations, no oversight, no consequences. He could observe how bodies changed under stress, how diseases spread, how two genetically identical individuals might respond differently to the same conditions. He could ask questions that, in any other place, would never be allowed to exist. And here, he could answer them. The children did not see the full picture. They saw a man who spoke calmly, who sometimes offered small gestures that felt out of place in a lager. A piece of candy, a reassuring word, a moment of attention. In a world stripped of humanity, even the smallest sign of it could be enough to create trust. And that trust was dangerous, because it blurred the line between care and control, between treatment and something else entirely. The barracks became a kind of waiting room, not for healing, but for continuation. Each visit meant more observation, more comparison, more quiet documentation. The purpose was never explained. The future was never discussed. Only the present existed, structured, measured, controlled. And through it all, Mengele remained the same, composed, focused, certain. He was not experimenting randomly. He was following a logic, a belief system that told him what he was doing mattered, that it contributed to something larger, that the individuals in front of him were not ends in themselves, but means to an answer. That answer, whatever he believed it to be, justified everything. And that is where the true shift happened. Because by this point, the platform no longer mattered. The selections no longer defined him. This did. The quiet rooms, the controlled environment, the illusion of order masking something far more disturbing. The people who had been chosen were no longer part of the crowd. They were part of a process. And in that process, their fate was no longer uncertain. It was already decided. They just didn't know it yet. They believed they had been spared, separated, protected. But in Auschwitz, being chosen did not mean survival. It meant something else entirely. They were not being protected. They were being prepared. Behind the quiet routines, behind the measurements and the calm conversations, there was a purpose that no one explained, because it didn't need to be explained. Not to him. When Josef Mengele walked into those rooms, everything about him remained the same. Clean uniform, steady voice, controlled movements. There was no visible shift between the man on the platform and the man inside the barracks. Only the setting changed. The intention did not. What happened there was not random. It followed structure. There were notes, records, observations carefully written down, comparisons made over time, patterns tracked, differences analyzed. This was not chaos disguised as science. It was science, stripped of everything that made it human. Mengele was particularly focused on one idea: heredity. How traits were passed from one generation to the next. How physical characteristics appeared, disappeared, repeated. And most importantly, whether they could be controlled. Twins, to him, were the perfect key. Two individuals with nearly identical genetic beginnings. If something changed in one, but not the other, it meant something. If both reacted the same way, it meant something else. Every difference was data. Every similarity, confirmation. This was how he thought. Not in terms of suffering, not in terms of harm, but in terms of results. The children, especially the twins, were brought in repeatedly. They stood side by side, observed, measured again, and again. Height, weight, eye color, bone structure, responses to conditions. Everything documented with quiet precision. The repetition mattered, because he was not looking for a moment. He was looking for patterns, and patterns required time. To the outside world, this might have sounded like research. Inside Auschwitz, it became something else entirely, because there was no consent, no limit, no question of whether something should be done, only whether it could be done. And if it could, it would be. Witnesses who survived would later describe the same unsettling detail. He did not appear emotional. There was no anger, no visible excitement, no hesitation. He worked the way a doctor works when examining a patient, focused, detached, professional. And that was what made it so difficult to understand. Because nothing about him matched what people expected cruelty to look like. He did not look like someone causing harm. He looked like someone doing his job. At times, he would speak to the children, ask simple questions, observe how they responded. He remembered them, recognized them on sight. In an environment where most people were reduced to numbers, this recognition created a dangerous illusion. It made him seem different, not kind, but not immediately threatening. And that difference mattered, because it allowed everything else to continue without resistance. The process expanded over time. More observations, more comparisons, more attempts to understand how the human body could be influenced, shaped, altered. The details were not always visible to those outside the rooms, but the pattern was. People were taken in, studied, and often never returned in the same way, or at all. And still, the system continued, efficient, ordered, unquestioned. Mengele was not working in isolation. He was part of a larger structure, one that encouraged results, valued data, and removed every ethical barrier that might have existed elsewhere. In that structure, success was not measured by compassion. It was measured by output, by findings, by the ability to contribute to something the regime considered important. And he did, without hesitation, without doubt. Because in his mind there was no conflict between what he was doing and what he believed. The people in front of him were not individuals in the way the world understood individuals. They were variables, subjects, steps toward an answer. And that answer, whatever form he imagined it would take, justified everything that came before it. The world would later look back and call it cruelty, call it inhuman, call it something beyond understanding. But inside those rooms, at that time, under that system, it had a different name, research. And as the war outside began to shift, as fronts collapsed and the outcome became less certain, none of this stopped. Not immediately. Not even when the system itself began to break. Because for Josef Mengele, the work was not tied to victory. It was tied to belief. And belief does not disappear when reality changes. It adapts, it hides, it survives. And soon, so would he. As the war collapsed, so did the system that had protected him. By late 1944, the illusion of control was already breaking. The front lines were shifting. The sounds in the distance were no longer distant. What had once felt permanent, organized, precise, unstoppable, was beginning to fracture. Orders changed, then changed again. And inside Auschwitz, the rhythm that had once defined everything began to fall apart. Trains slowed, records disappeared. People were moved, relocated, erased, not just from the lagera, but from the paperwork that proved they had ever existed. The system was trying to hide itself, because it understood something its architects had refused to admit. This was ending. And when systems collapse, they don't do it cleanly. They unravel. For the prisoners, this meant forced marches, chaos, uncertainty. For the guards, it meant decisions. Stay, fight, or leave. And for Josef Mengele, the choice was clear. He did not stay to defend anything. He did not try to preserve what had been built. He left. Not dramatically, not in panic, but deliberately. Because unlike those who believed until the end, Mengele understood something else. The system that gave him power could no longer protect him. And without it, he was just a man with a name that would soon matter. Too much. In January 1945, as Soviet forces approached Auschwitz, the camp was evacuated. Prisoners were forced westward in brutal marches through winter conditions. Guards followed orders. Chaos spread through the structure that had once seemed unshakable. And somewhere within that collapse, Mengele disappeared. He left the camp before its liberation. No confrontation, no final moment, no reckoning, just absence. He moved west, blending into the retreating Nemetsky units, wearing the uniform that still gave him a kind of protection, at least for a while. Because in those final months, Germany was filled with men like him, officers, doctors, administrators, all trying to become something else before it was too late. Names were dropped, documents destroyed, identities reshaped. The goal was simple: survive the end. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the war was over. But for many of those who had served the regime, something else had just begun. The search. Trials were organized, lists were compiled, names were written down, those responsible for the system, for the Lagererie, for the decisions that had shaped millions of lives and deaths. Some of those men were found quickly, some were captured, some stood in courtrooms, facing the world that now demanded answers. But not all of them. Because in the immediate aftermath of the war, the scale of collapse created something unexpected: confusion. Millions of displaced people, ruined cities, broken communication. And in that chaos, it became possible, just barely, for someone to disappear. Mengele was captured at one point by American forces, but not as Josef Mengele. He was registered under a different name, another soldier, another face in a sea of defeated men. And because his identifying SS tattoo had been removed, or went unnoticed, he was not recognized as someone of importance. Not yet. So he was released, set free into a world that should have been hunting him. It wasn't a dramatic escape, no chase, no narrow evasion, just a failure to see him for what he was. And that was enough. From that moment on, Josef Mengele ceased to exist in any official sense. The name remained on lists, on documents, in testimonies, but the man himself was gone. He moved through Germany quietly. No uniform, no title, no authority. Just another man trying to rebuild a life in the ruins. He worked on farms, avoided attention, kept his past buried under layers of silence. And for a time, it worked. Because the world was focused on rebuilding, on recovery, on understanding what had just happened. There were trials. There was justice, at least for some. But justice requires clarity. And clarity was in short supply, especially when the person you were looking for had already learned how to become invisible. Mengele did not try to justify himself publicly. He did not defend his actions. He did not seek to explain. He simply removed himself from the narrative and waited. Years passed. The urgency faded. The search became less immediate. And with each passing moment, the possibility of capture grew smaller. Because time does something dangerous in cases like this. It creates distance. And distance creates doubt. Faces change. Memories blur. Details become harder to verify. And a man who once stood at the center of something unthinkable can slowly shift into something else entirely. A rumor, a name, a shadow. While the world was looking for monsters, he became invisible. He didn't run forever. He settled. After the war, Europe was no longer a place where a man like Josef Mengele could remain safely hidden. Not for long. His name had begun to circulate. Testimonies were being collected. Lists were growing. It was only a matter of time, and he knew it. So, in the late 1940s, he made a decision that many others like him had already made. He would leave Europe behind. The path out was not official. It wasn't legal, but it existed. A network, quiet, organized, and disturbingly effective, helped former members of the Nazi regime escape. Through false papers, sympathetic contacts, and carefully arranged routes, men who should have been standing trial instead found passage across borders. Italy became a gateway. Ports became exits. And from there, ships carried them far from the ruins of Germany to places where questions were fewer and answers harder to verify. For Mengele, that destination was Argentina. At the time, Argentina had become a refuge for many former Nazis. Under the government of Juan Perón, the country offered both opportunity and distance. Distance from Europe, distance from accountability, distance from the past. Mengele arrived there in 1949 under a false identity, a new name, a new beginning. And at first, his life looked normal. He lived in Buenos Aires, a city far removed from everything he had once been part of. He found work. He made contacts. He integrated into a community that in many cases did not ask too many questions, or perhaps didn't want to know the answers. He was not hiding in a basement. He was not constantly running. He was living, walking through streets, speaking with people, building a version of himself that no longer matched the name on the lists back in Europe. And that is what makes this part of the story so unsettling. Because the man who had stood on that platform, deciding life and death with a movement of his hand, was now part of everyday life, unnoticed, untouched. For a time, he even used his real name, not always, not publicly, but enough to suggest something dangerous. He did not believe he would be caught, and for a while he was right. But the world had not completely forgotten. In 1960, something changed. Israeli intelligence agents located and captured Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires, another key figure of the Nazi system. His trial sent a message across the world. The search was not over. And suddenly, the name Mengele began to resurface with new urgency. He realized it almost immediately. Argentina was no longer safe. The illusion of distance was gone. So once again, he moved. First to Paraguay, where he obtained citizenship under another identity. And when even that began to feel uncertain, he moved again. To Brazil. Each move made him harder to track. Each new name added another layer between him and the man he had once been. But something else was changing too. His life was becoming smaller, more isolated, more cautious. The confidence he had once carried began to shift into something else. Not fear exactly, but awareness. He knew he was being looked for, even if no one had found him yet. He relied on a small circle of people, contacts who provided shelter, work, protection. Without them, his new life would not have been possible. But this was not freedom, not entirely. It was survival. A quiet existence built on the understanding that everything could collapse at any moment. And yet, through all of this, one thing did not change. He never admitted guilt. There were no public statements, no confessions, no attempts to explain or justify his actions. But in private, in letters and conversations, he expressed something far more unsettling. He did not believe he had done anything wrong, not in the way the world defined wrong. To him, what had happened in Auschwitz was part of a system, a necessary process, something tied to ideas he had once believed in completely. And belief, even after everything had not fully disappeared, it had adapted, quietly, just like he had. Years passed. The world moved forward. New conflicts, new headlines, new priorities. The search for men like Mengele continued, but it was no longer at the center of global attention. And that was enough, because time, once again, worked in his favor. The longer he remained hidden, the less visible he became, the less urgent his capture seemed, until he was no longer seen as a man moving through real places, but as something else, a possibility, a rumor, a ghost of a past the world was still trying to understand. He was no longer the man on the platform. He was no longer even the man in the records. He was something harder to find, something that slipped through borders, through names, through time itself. And while the world searched for him, he kept living. No final confrontation, no moment where the world caught up with him. For years, the name Josef Mengele moved through conversations, reports, intelligence files. He was searched for, tracked, discussed. His past was known, his actions documented by those who had survived. But the man himself remained out of reach. By the late 1970s, the search had not completely stopped, but it had changed. It was quieter now, less urgent. The world had moved on to other crises, other conflicts, other stories, and somewhere far from where his name had once meant everything, he was still alive, living under another identity, a different name, a smaller life. In Brazil, far from the platform, far from the system that had once defined him, he had become something almost unrecognizable, not powerful, not visible, just a man growing older. There were no uniforms anymore, no authority, no system to support him, only time, and time, for once, was not on his side. On February 7th, 1979, while swimming near the coast, he collapsed. A stroke, sudden, silent. There were no witnesses who understood who he was in that moment. No one calling his name, no one demanding answers. He slipped beneath the water and drowned. And just like that, it was over. Not with a trial, not with a verdict, but with an accident, an ending so ordinary it almost feels unreal. For years after his death, uncertainty remained. Rumors continued. Sightings were reported. The idea that he was still out there, still hiding, still escaping, refused to disappear. Because the truth was difficult to accept, that someone like him could simply live and then die without ever being held accountable. It wasn't until 1985 that his remains were officially identified, confirming what many had feared. He had never been caught, never stood before a court, never answered for what he had done. The world had been ready, ready for a trial, for explanations, for some kind of closure, but none of it came. There was no moment where he was forced to speak, no moment where he had to listen, no moment where the weight of everything was placed in front of him and named for what it was. Instead, there was silence, and in that silence, something unsettling remains. Because history often tells us that justice, eventually, finds its way, that the worst crimes demand an ending that makes sense, that there is a final chapter where everything is accounted for. But this story doesn't end that way. The man who once stood on a platform, deciding who would live and who would disappear, disappeared himself. No sentence, no verdict, no justice. Only time, doing what it does best, letting things fade. But some things don't fade. Not really, because they were never resolved, never answered, never finished. And maybe that is the most uncomfortable truth of all. Evil doesn't always end in a courtroom. Sometimes it just walks away.